Good morning. On behalf of the Forum of Federations, I would like to welcome everyone, participants, spectators. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for this very eminent panel on federalism and climate change. This is the first of a series of events that the Forum will be organizing in connection with its 20th year of operations. The Forum was founded by the Government of Canada in the year 2000, and so 2020 would have been our 20th year. And we had actually planned a major conference around the 20th anniversary of the Forum. However, since we are all living through the COVID pandemic, this was not possible. But what we've tried to do this year is to have, rather than a physical conference, a series of events looking at what an international dialogue looking at the future of federalism, and picking on what one might consider are very live topics in the context of the practice of federalism. Our first event today is on climate change and federalism. Our next panel next week will be on fragility and federalism. The week after, we'll be looking at the issue of megacities and federalism, then media and federalism, and on the 1st of June, the issue of intergovernmental relations and the future of federalism in the context of everything that we've been through in the pandemic year since last year. The Forum of Federations, although founded by the Government of Canada, over the course of the last 20 years, it has attracted a number of partner governments. These have included countries on all continents. So we've had partners like Australia, India, Pakistan, Germany, Switzerland, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Brazil, Mexico, in addition to Canada. And so over the last 20 years, the Forum has had the privilege of working around the world, working in over 40 countries on issues related to the practice of federalism in established federations, but also supporting countries transitioning to democracy and trying to establish federal and decentralized systems. So it's a real privilege for us to be able to engage with people around the world. And we want to thank all our supporters, both governments who have contributed to the Forum, as well as experts who've shared their expertise to the Forum in helping build the institution over the last 20 years. In this context, I would like to acknowledge that the subject of climate change and federalism is one where the Forum has been supported by the Government of Quebec, and Sébastien Jourdain, who is going to be moderating this panel today, is one of the co-editors of a comparative volume that the Forum will be publishing in due course as part of the support from the Government of Quebec. And in this context, we're very, very grateful that Mr. Jean-François Gibault, the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Office of Electrification and Climate Change from the Government of Quebec, is able to join us this morning and to make some opening statements. With this, I will hand over to Sébastien. Sébastien, thank you very much for taking the time to moderate this panel. Sébastien Jourdain is Assistant Professor at McGill University's Faculty of Law and holds the Canada Research Chair in Human Rights, Health and the Environment. Thank you, Jourdain. Professor Jourdain, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rupak, for those words of introduction. Aujourd'hui, on va parler de gouvernance des changements climatiques et fédéralisme. L'accord de Paris signé en 2015 reconnaît que les provinces, les États et les municipalités ont un rôle essentiel à jouer en contribuant à la réalisation des objectifs de lutte contre le changement climatique. Et c'est évident que la gouvernance fédérale va jouer un rôle important dans la résolution de la crise climatique dans le monde. En fait, la majorité des plus grands émetteurs sont soit des fédérations ou des pays dotés de systèmes de gouvernance décentralisés. Et donc, dans ce contexte-là, la réalisation des objectifs mondiaux d'atténuation du changement climatique va donc dépendre en grande partie de la possibilité et de la manière dont les gouvernements à différents niveaux, à différentes échelles, vont pouvoir coopérer pour réduire les émissions de carbone et aussi assurer que la société est résiliente aux impacts des changements climatiques. Donc, dans le cadre d'un projet plus large qui est financé par le gouvernement du Québec, avec ma collègue Joanna Setzer qui va nous joindre plus tard. On co-dirige un ouvrage qui compare en fait la réponse au changement climatique, la façon avec laquelle ça s'arrime avec les institutions, les pratiques du fédéralisme ou de la gouvernance décentralisée dans une quinzaine de pays. Donc, ce livre est en voie de préparation. On espère qu'il soit publié d'ici la fin de l'année ou l'année prochaine. Et on a le plaisir d'avoir avec nous une des autrices des chapitres dans ce livre. Donc, justement, je vais venir au panel. Alors, nous avons d'abord M. Jean-François Gibault, qui est sous-ministre adjoint au Bureau d'électrification et de changement climatique au ministère de l'Environnement et de la lutte au changement climatique du gouvernement du Québec depuis novembre 2020. Auparavant, en 2018 et 2020, il avait occupé les fonctions de directeur de la recherche à l'agence QMI et au bureau d'enquête du Journal de Montréal. M. Gibault cumule également près de 15 années d'expérience en cabinet parlementaire et ministériel. Après M. Gibault, on va entendre Mr. Molune G. Hedeto, who's a senior technical advisor with the Commission of Climate Change, Forest and Environment for the government of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. He has more than 12 years of experience as a university lecturer, researcher in the field of climate change and the environment. And he holds a MA in International Relations and a BA in Political Science and International Relations from Addis Ababa University. Afterwards, we will hear from Catherine Harrison, who's a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia. Before entering academia, Professor Harrison worked as a policy analyst for both Environment Canada and the United States Congress. She's also served as a senior associate, dean and acting dean in the UBC Faculty of Arts. And of course, she's published widely on federalism and Canadian and US climate policy and advised governments from the local to international level. And we're quite happy that she is an author of our chapter on Canada for the edited book. Next, we'll have George Millbrandt, who's chairman of the board of the former federations. He's recently been appointed as vice president of the advisory committee of the German Stability Council. His political career includes being minister president of the Federal Free State of Saxony and chair of Saxony's Christian Democratic Union. He's also been a member of the German Bundesrat as well as the Parliament of Saxony. We'll also hear from Nidhi Srivastava, who's a law and policy consultant based in New Delhi in India, and a lawyer by training who's over 15 years of experience in legal and policy research on issues relating to the environment, natural resources, energy, and climate change, and who has worked with the Energy and Resources Institute and WWF India, and also worked specifically on environmental federalism for the Interstate Council Secretariat and the Finance Commissions of the Government of India, and is currently a fellow at the Center for Multi-Level Federalism at the Institute of Social Science in India. And towards the end of the event, and at some point in the middle of the event, we'll be joined by my colleague and the co-editor of the book, Joanna Setzer, who is an assistant professorial research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where she leads the Climate Change Laws of the World project, and also regularly advises a range of international governments and non-governmental organizations. So that is our panel. We are panelists. We will have a very rich discussion. So let me just start by telling you, just to give you an overview of the event. We'll start with some words of introduction, opening remarks from the representative of the Quebec government, Mr. Gibault, as I've mentioned. And then we will have 2 rounds of questions that the panelists will answer. The first will be around the role of federal and multilateral governments in addressing climate change. And the second will be around key challenges and solutions in this area. And finally, I want to mention that we are encouraging questions from the audience. If you have any questions, si vous avez donc des questions, s'il vous plaît, écrivez-les dans le chat. Donc, si vous êtes en français, en fait, si vous nous suivez en français, vous pouvez écrire votre question dans la section, donc sur Facebook, dans la section des commentaires. Et si vous nous écoutez en anglais, vous pouvez écrire vos questions dans la boîte du clavardage pour YouTube. Et en fait, quelqu'un va prendre vos questions et nous les envoyer et on va s'assurer de les poser aux panélistes. Donc, voilà, ça c'est ce qui est pour l'événement. Donc, je vais maintenant donner la parole à M. Gibault.
Merci, M. Jodoin. Monsieur le Président du Forum des fédérations, Mesdames et Messieurs les panélistes, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du public. D'entrée de jeu, j'aimerais remercier le Forum des fédérations qui m'a invité à prendre la parole aujourd'hui à titre de représentant du gouvernement du Québec. Le Québec participe régulièrement aux activités du Forum depuis plusieurs années, en plus d'être un partenaire financier. Je suis particulièrement enthousiaste de pouvoir m'adresser à vous dans le cadre de ce panel afin d'expliquer de quelle façon le Québec s'y est pris pour assumer pleinement ses responsabilités sur son territoire et jouer un rôle de premier plan dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques en travaillant avec les autres gouvernements de l'ensemble canadien et à travers le monde. Au Canada, comme vous le savez, les deux ordres de gouvernement disposent de compétences constitutionnelles permettant d'agir en matière d'environnement. Cela confère donc un rôle incontournable et fondamental aux provinces dans la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Évidemment, chaque entité de l'ensemble développe une approche qui correspond à ses orientations et préférences, ce qui a créé un portrait varié à l'échelle pan-canadienne. Pour sa part, le Québec considère depuis toujours qu'il appartient d'abord et avant tout aux provinces d'assumer un leadership énergétique en matière de changement climatique. En ce sens, nous avons annoncé à l'automne dernier le plan pour une économie verte accompagné d'investissements de plus de 14 milliards de dollars dans des nouveaux projets de transport en commun électrifiés et près de 7 milliards de dollars additionnels pour électrifier encore davantage l'économie du Québec au cours des 5 prochaines années. Déjà, 98 % de notre électricité est renouvelable. Nous en exportons des quantités importantes vers les États voisins de la Nouvelle-Angleterre et de New York. Ce plan s'inscrit dans la continuité du plan d'action sur les changements climatiques qui s'échelonnait de 2013 à 2021 et qui lui-même était précédé d'actions qui ont pavé la voie pour un leadership du Québec en matière de changement climatique. À ce sujet, permettez-moi de préciser que la cible de réduction des GES du Québec, qui est de 37,5 %, demeure la plus ambitieuse au Canada parce qu'elle est basée sur l'année de référence 1990. La nouvelle cible canadienne, de 45 % sous le niveau de 2005, ne tient pas compte de la hausse des émissions de 23 % qui fut observée au Canada entre 1990 et 2005. Le Québec a déjà fait des choix dans le passé qui lui permettent aujourd'hui d'avoir les émissions par habitant parmi les plus basses en Amérique du Nord, 2 fois moins que la moyenne canadienne et américaine. Le leadership du Québec sur les changements climatiques s'est également illustré par la mise en place d'un mécanisme de tarification du carbone qui prend la forme d'un système de plafonnement et d'échange de droits d'émission de GES, aussi connu sous le nom de marché du carbone. Ce marché, qui a été instauré en 2013 et lié à celui de la Californie l'année suivante, en 2014, est aujourd'hui le plus grand en Amérique du Nord. Son objectif premier est de réduire les émissions de gaz à effet de serre en attribuant un coût à la pollution, ce qui envoie un signal de prix dans l'économie et incite les entreprises et les citoyens à innover et à modifier leur comportement. Pour nous, le choix d'un marché du carbone s'est imposé de lui-même, étant donné l'efficacité et l'efficience de ce mécanisme, qui a comme avantage de garantir les réductions tout en les réalisant là où elles coûtent le moins cher. Notre marché génère aussi d'importants revenus qui sont versés au Fonds d'électrification et de changement climatique. Depuis 2013, ce sont plus de 4,7 milliards de dollars qui ont été versés. Ces revenus sont réinvestis en totalité dans des mesures qui permettent au Québec de réduire ses émissions de GES, de mieux s'adapter aux conséquences des changements climatiques et d'accélérer son virage vers une économie à la fois forte et sobre en carbone. En plus des revenus provenant du marché du carbone, le gouvernement du Québec consacrera 1,7 milliard de ses revenus généraux à la lutte contre les changements climatiques pour un total de près de 7 milliards de dollars au cours des 5 prochaines années. Le Québec a donc une approche intégrée où, d'une part, on met un prix sur le carbone pour réduire les émissions de GES de la façon la plus efficiente possible. Et d'autre part, on verse toutes les recettes générées dans un fonds dédié à la lutte contre les changements climatiques qui sert à financer des programmes qui répondent aux objectifs climatiques du Québec. La liaison de notre marché du carbone et celui de la Californie a également contribué à fortement dynamiser l'action climatique du Québec tout en lui permettant de faire preuve de leadership sur les scènes canadiennes et internationales. Rappelons qu'en 2015, le Québec avait convié les provinces et territoires à un grand sommet sur les changements climatiques. Un des objectifs de ce sommet était de faire valoir leur rôle pour contribuer au succès de la conférence internationale sur le climat qui devait se tenir à Paris plus tard dans la même année, c'était en décembre 2015. À l'issue de cette rencontre importante, ils ont souscrit à une déclaration dans laquelle ils ont réaffirmé leur engagement commun envers la lutte contre les changements climatiques. Ce sommet et cette déclaration ont jeté les bases sur lesquelles a été signée la déclaration de Vancouver, qui a éventuellement mené au cadre pan-canadien sur la croissance propre et les changements climatiques, qui était la première action pan-canadienne réunissant l'ensemble des gouvernements au Canada sur le sujet. Évidemment, pour ceux qui connaissent le dossier, bien des choses ont changé depuis. Certaines provinces ont révisé leurs ambitions. De l'autre côté, le gouvernement fédéral a pris une place plus importante à partir de la fin de l'année 2015. Il est important de mentionner la genèse de cette action climatique qui témoigne de ce qui peut être accompli lorsqu'on prend en main ses responsabilités, comme l'a fait le Québec par son leadership au sein de la Fédération canadienne. Cela étant dit, le Québec ne limite pas son action à son seul territoire ou à la scène canadienne. Le Québec fait sa part également et agit comme leader à l'échelle internationale. Il met de l'avant son expertise et ses meilleures pratiques depuis plus d'une décennie dans des organisations, partenariats et alliances stratégiques. Il entend mettre à profit son énergie renouvelable au bénéfice de la transition énergétique de ses voisins. Il contribue également à l'effort mondial de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre et d'adaptation au changement et aux impacts au changement climatique en s'engageant dans la coopération climatique internationale. Pour le Québec, cela se traduit aussi par notre participation aux événements d'envergure en changement climatique. Notons par exemple la présence du premier ministre du Québec à la conférence de Paris. Le Québec fait également partie de la coalition Under 2, qui regroupe des États fédérés et infranationaux engagés dans une action des objectifs de l'accord de Paris. D'ailleurs, le Québec s'est déclaré lié à cet accord. Comme je l'ai mentionné précédemment, le fait que nous ayons opté pour un marché du carbone lié à celui de la Californie a ouvert la porte à une implication marquée du Québec sur la question de la tarification du carbone à l'international. Le Québec est engagé dans un processus informel d'échange d'informations avec la Nouvelle-Zélande depuis avril 2017 sur les questions, les différentes caractéristiques et le fonctionnement de leur marché du carbone. En 2020, le Québec et le Chili ont convenu de débuter un processus régulier d'échange d'informations en matière de marché du carbone, de transition énergétique et d'autres moyens pour lutter contre les changements climatiques. Le Québec participe aussi depuis plus de 3 ans à des téléconférences bi-hebdomadaires avec le Mexique et la Californie, afin d'aider le Mexique à mettre sur pied son marché du carbone. Le Québec s'est doté des moyens de ses ambitions climatiques. Donc, certainement, nous nous réjouissons quand d'autres États démontrent le même niveau d'initiative, car comme notre propre expérience en témoigne, non seulement il ne s'agit pas de laisser le fardeau de l'action climatique reposer uniquement sur les épaules des gouvernements centraux, mais de surcroît, les États fédérés peuvent jouer un rôle de premier plan, celui d'initiateur, de précurseur, de chef de file en matière de lutte contre les changements climatiques. En terminant, je me réjouis que l'action climatique québécoise repose sur un consensus politique fort. L'ensemble des partis à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec adoptaient d'ailleurs, le 22 avril dernier, une résolution unanime en réponse à l'appel du président Biden à avoir une réelle ambition pour le climat. En ce qui nous concerne, le Québec continuera non seulement à prendre pleinement en main ses responsabilités climatiques sur son territoire, mais également à exercer son leadership à l'échelle canadienne et nord-américaine dans la francophonie et au niveau multilatéral pour limiter le réchauffement climatique et ses effets néfastes, et aussi pour concilier environnement et prospérité économique. Je souhaite des échanges fructueux et inspirants à tous. Une bonne journée. Merci.
Ben, merci beaucoup, M. Gibault, pour cette déclaration d'ouverture. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous allez pouvoir... je ne pense pas que vous allez rester avec nous pour tout le panel, mais pour la partie que vous pourrez, à laquelle vous pourrez assister, ben, c'est super. Et sinon, ben, on vous souhaite une belle journée dans vos autres dossiers importants. Donc, on va commencer avec la première partie du panel, la première question, qui est pourquoi est-ce que les gouvernements fédéraux et des gouvernements ayant pourquoi est-ce que les pays qui ont une structure fédéraliste ou une structure de gouvernance décentralisée ou à plusieurs niveaux sont des joueurs importants dans la lutte au changement climatique? Donc, je demanderais à ce moment-ci à mes panélistes de me rejoindre et donc d'ouvrir leur caméra. Donc, Nidhi, Jog, Catherine, Mouloni, si vous voulez, if you'd like to turn your cameras on and join me. Okay, wonderful. So, on va commencer avec la première question. So again, the first question is, why are federal and multi-level governments around the world important players in addressing climate change? So let's start with Nidhi, your views on this.
Right. Thank you so much. Before I start, I would like to thank the organizers for including me in the panel and such an important topic. In response to your question, it is very clear that international commitments ultimately trickle down to lower levels. The countries, whether collectively or individually, they can set targets for 1.5 degrees, 5.5 degrees, or whatever. But the implementation and giving effect to those targets cannot happen without involving multi-level governments, because these levels, states and cities and even villages, are closer to the people, and they are the ones which feel the impact of climate change more directly. What is important in this whole climate governance federalism is the issue of differences. There are differences in priorities and opportunities of different levels of government and amongst subnational governments. So there are obviously states which have high potential of GHG emissions reduction, renewable energy potential. There are also states with potential for increasing forest cover and creating carbon sinks for the entire country or the world at large. Similar differences exist in terms of vulnerability, because vulnerability depends on a number of factors. It could include geographic, socioeconomic, demographic, institutional, et cetera, et cetera. So some states are naturally more vulnerable to threats due to climate change. And we've seen coastal states or states which are closer to glaciers, they have been at the receiving end. So there is one level of differences that we see here in terms of natural conditions and associated priorities and opportunities. There is also a difference in efforts needed and the institutions that exist to respond to these. And we see that the cost of climate governance is different for different levels and governments. And often there is a gap between the fiscal autonomy that the subnational governments have in terms of raising revenue and the responsibility that they have when it comes to matters of environment. And similar differences exist in terms of capacity to take action, whether it's technical or human resources. And it is precisely this reason, such differences, that require or call for action at all levels. And there is a need for streamlining and alignment of individual actions towards the larger national and global goal of climate change mitigation and adaptation. And this is where federal governments can play an important role, especially in improving information flows and strengthening capacity, both technical and financial, of subnational governments. Because this cannot happen with any one unit of government working in silos. There are these are areas that require cooperative federalism. Another issue or point that I would like to raise is of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, CBDR, which is a concept, a principle which we hear a lot in the international debate around climate change and UNFCCC, which recognizes different capabilities and differing responsibilities of individual countries, since it's based on historical as well as current context. I strongly feel that we need to extend this narrative to multi-level governments and federalism, because concerns, contribution, responsibilities, capabilities, and circumstances, they vary across levels of government and even horizontally across different subnational units. So therefore, as also mentioned in the opening remarks, provinces are leading the way and sharing experiences and expertise with each other, and not just within their country, but with subnational governments of other countries as well. So there is definitely a case for that. In my work, I have seen quite often that states are often caught between ambitions of the federal government and aspirations of the people. So it does pose a challenge for them, but it also serves as an opportunity to take meaningful action and make a difference, because they act as a bridge between the two. So therefore, in my opinion, and that is the reason why a lot of subnational governments are coming up with innovative solutions for climate change. The climate action must allow for engagement of multi-level governments.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Thank you. So I'll turn now to Malune for your views on the why countries with federal or decentralized systems of governance are so important in addressing climate change.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, depending on where you are. I would like to thank the organizers for having me, and I'm really very excited to be part of this international dialogue entitled Climate Change and Federal Governance, which is organized basically to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the forums of federations. I think right from the very beginning, I have to admit that demystifying climate change and federalism nexus is not really an easy task, obviously because of a different factor, which I'm not going to do well into. That being said, let me directly try to say a few words about the question posed by Professor Sebastian, which is why federal and multi-level governments around the world are very important players or key players in terms of addressing climate change. I personally believe that understanding the nature of climate change itself, as well as its structural causes, somehow helps us to answer the question you just posed, Professor. To begin with, we have to bear in mind that climate change is a global phenomenon. It's a global problem that affects everyone in every corner of our planet. whether we are rich or whether we are poor or whether we are living in the global south or the global north. We have been experiencing or facing the impacts of climate change, be it in the forms of heat waves or droughts or floods or cyclones or wildfires, and then in fact the list goes on. So global problem such as climate change with this kind of magnitude basically necessitates or requires or calls for concerted and coordinated efforts of all actors. And I personally believe that federations or federal systems, by its virtue of embracing diversity, which we are talking about, the existence of multiple actors across value chains, and also exercising shared decision-making in the process of designing and implementing various policies is well suited to address the types of transboundary and also multi-scale crisis. So this is the first issue we need to bear in mind, that the nature of the climate change itself, which is global, which is transboundary, which is multi-scale, by itself calls for a federated kind of system. And again, it's equally important to underscore the fact that human beings are the main or the driving factor for climate change. We're talking about here about human-induced climate change. We all know that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, primarily driven by population growth, economic activities, lifestyle we are following, energy use, land use pattern, blah, blah, are the main causes for changing climate change. So that the mitigation aspect has to do with human beings. And this is in fact compounded by the fact that the majority of the largest emitters, GHG gases, are either federations or have adopted systems of what we call decentralized governance, as Professor was mentioning at the beginning of this webinar. So we have to bring on board the federal entities in order to address the impacts of climate change, whether we like it or not. In fact, the Paris Agreement has clearly recognized that the federal entities, including provinces, states, municipalities, and other entities, have a very crucial role in order to realize global mitigation and adaptation goals envisioned under the Paris Agreement and also under the United Nations Framework Convention on climate change. So the federal entities play again very important role from this vantage of pointers. I think the other important point we need to also raise in the context of why federal entities are very important in order to address climate change has to do with designing and implementation of climate policies. We all know that the federal system has a huge room in terms of entertaining divergent views, in terms of bringing on board various actors while crafting national policies on various issues, including climate change. And this, by extension, basically paves the way for the division of labor between the federal and regional entities, where the federal governments most often focus on interventions mainly related to coordinating climate actions at the national and international levels, among others by setting, for instance, national targets and also representing national interests under international forums, and also mobilizing climate finance for local activities, and the list goes on. While the regional governments, the local governments, national governments actually implement interventions related to climate change adaptation and mitigation at the grassroots level. So this division of labor that is embedded in the federal system by itself calls for or invites the federal systems to be part of the to be part of addressing the impacts of climate change. So this is just simply data, the global nature of climate change, and also structural causes basically necessitates federations to play an indispensable role in addressing it, whether we like it or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'll turn now to Catherine Harrison.
Good morning, everyone. I'll be brief on this question because my colleagues have already said much of what I would say and done so better than I would have said. Why are federal and multi-level governments important? Well, first, many of them are in the top 10 emitters when it comes to climate change. The US is the second largest, India, Russia, Germany, Canada. If we treated the EU as a de facto federation, that's another 9% of global emissions. So a very significant, by my estimate, just under half of global emissions are being released by federal or de facto federal systems. So it's going to be an important part of the conversation. Secondly, many of the countries that aren't in the top 10, developing countries in particular, that have federal systems have great potential for their emissions to grow if they follow the same carbon intensive path that wealthy countries did. So that group of countries is going to be an important part of the discussion, that group of federal countries in moving forward to get to net zero. And finally, there are just lots of federal systems out there, and whether they're in the top 10 or not, whether their emissions are growing or not, like everyone else, they're going to need to get to net zero over the next few decades if we're going to solve the problem of climate change. And those federal countries are going to need to do that in the context of more complicated political institutions. They'll have different divisions of powers, different political incentives, different financial capacities. For reasons I'll get into on the second question in discussing the Canadian experience, I think that can be more challenging in a federal system of government than in a unitary one. So I think it's going to be important, just given the challenges that those federal systems face, that they share best practices in terms of coordination, coming to common purpose, fiscal arrangements, and so on.
Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful recap of everything that's been mentioned in many ways. So, Mr. Millbrandt, if you would like to also intervene on this question of why federalism is relevant to the fight against climate change. You are muted. This is the classic quote of our time.
Thank you very much. As my colleague said before, climate change is a global problem, it's a global externality, so you need in the end a global solution. And a decentralized solution is a special challenge for this kind of problem. Coming back to our experience in Germany, we have two types of experience. We are a federation with German states which have some sort of autonomy on the one hand side, and we are a member of, as it was said, a de facto federation, the European Union. And therefore we have to balance the activities on all three levels. The state, provincial level, you would say Canada, the national level, and the European level. According to our constitution, most of the German problem is solved because the federation has the exclusive and concurrent power to legislate on all energy and mining matters, as well as on energy excise taxes. It can regulate forest and agriculture matters. In the past, the federation has used all these powers and had regulate all important instruments which are interesting to avoid and reduce CO2 emissions, as well as to subsidize the generation and use of green energy. Therefore, a German state has no possibility to pursue an own isolated or independent climate policy, so he has to adapt to the national policy. However, in Germany, the state governments can influence federal climate policy through the Federal Council, which participates in the legislation and administration of the federation and in matters concerning the European Union. And the Federal Council consists of members of the state. Most forms of energy have been subject to different excise taxes, but unsystematically concerning climate policy. If you calculate the tax burden in relation to carbon emissions, the burden on heating oil is the lowest, followed by heating gas. The highest burden is on fuels for vehicles. For more than 2 decades, Germany has pursued an ambitious policy of energy transition, changing the structure of its energy system to reduce greenhouse gas emission by more than 40% in 2002 compared to 1990. And we want to reach climate neutrality by 2050. Coal mining and combustion is gradually phased out, at least until 2038. And as a consequence of this policy, carbon energy in production, transportation and heating must be substituted by electricity or green hydrogen. And all electric energy should be produced by green sources. And it means in Germany predominantly by wind and solar, because hydro and bioenergy are not so interesting because of our geography and population density. Another challenge is that we abandon nuclear energy at the end of next year, and therefore will remain an energy importer. Green energy production is promoted by a special Renewable Energy Act, which prioritizes grid feed of renewable energy and subsidizes its production by long-term guaranteed prices. The subsidies for green energy production and the grid modifications are financed by special levies on electricity consumption. As these elements guarantee a good profitability for private investors, the generation of green energy is booming. However, electricity consumption prices are the highest among industrial countries. As I said, climate change is a worldwide problem. We cannot depend on the national policy alone. National policies can distort national competitiveness and international trade and thereby lead to carbon leakage. Insofar, the global emissions are not reduced, but only shifting without any positive climate effect. To avoid this problem in Europe, the EU itself introduced an emission trading scheme in 2005, based on its important competencies by the European treaties to establish a single market, which means to remove not only monetary tariffs, but also all non-tariff trade barriers between the member countries and substitute them by a common policy on product regulation and on freedom of movement of goods and services, capital and labor. The EU member states, as well as the EU itself, signed the Kyoto Protocol with climate targets. After some teething problems in the beginning, this cap and trade system has become the cornerstone of the European policy to combat climate change, and it is the key tool for reducing greenhouse gas emission cost effectively. This European carbon emission market is the biggest market in the world. It's operating in all EU countries, plus Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, and the UK is linked to this market. This market covers around 50% of EU's carbon emissions and 40% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And because of this policy, the EU has achieved 25% reduction compared with 2019. On the other hand, we had a real growth rate of more than 60%. Growth rate was very high because of the enlargement of the East European countries, which have a huge potential for growth. So we have to adapt all policies, the national policies on the one hand side, especially our special way with the subsidizing renewable energies by some sort of tax on electricity on the one hand side, and the ETS system on the other side, which has some sort of some sort of problems. I would like to talk about these problems of national policy and European policy concerning the next question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I think we've laid the table here for the importance of federalism in addressing climate change as a global problem. And the two challenges that we're faced with are reducing carbon emissions by 2050 and also ensuring climate resilience to increasing and mounting climate impacts. So these are two huge challenges. And so what I want to invite the panelists now to discuss are how those challenges can be addressed in systems of governance that are federal or decentralized. So what are some of the key challenges that federal and subnational intergovernmental relations have created for policymakers in designing, implementing climate policies? And also what kind of opportunities has that generated, and what kind of solutions have governments developed to address those challenges? So again, we'll go with the same order. So I'll start with Nidhi, please, if you want to share your views.
Right, thank you. So the previous round of responses were very interesting, useful. And as you pointed out, the two main challenges of emissions reduction and building climate resilience is certainly there. And it becomes slightly more complex in federal systems. Indian model of federalism, as some of you already know, is unique. It's called centralized federalism or union model of federalism, quasi-federalism, etc. So it is in this context and framework that subnational concerns have traditionally been recognized. Adequately or inadequately, that's another issue. But for a country as diverse as India with so many subnational units, diversity and asymmetry have been significant to policymaking in different arenas, including environment and climate change. According to a very recent assessment published just end of April, out of nearly 30 states that we have, 8 states are the most vulnerable to climate change impacts, amounting to around 60% of the impact. So while we talk about climate change as a global concern, a national concern, we have to remember and recognize that some states are affected much more than the others. So coming to your question of challenges from the perspective of federalism, in India, firstly, the biggest challenge comes from the fact that the overall climate governance landscape is inherently fragmented and sectoral. We don't have a climate law or climate act. So in the absence of climate legislation, policy directives, announcements, statements by the federal government has been the core or the basis of climate action in the country and at subnational levels as well. The most important instrument that we have is the National Action Plan on Climate Change, which comprises standalone missions, roadmaps for different sectors, like renewable energy, energy efficiency, agriculture, forests, etc. So to synergize this otherwise fragmented and incremental sphere of climate action, it's very important that the federal government is there to play an active role. So that role is crucial. Another challenge, which is somewhat related to this, is the top-down nature of climate action and decisions. the National Action Plan that I just talked about was prepared and by the Prime Minister's Council, and with very little or negligible consultation with subnational governments. And states were just mandated to prepare their respective action plans in line with the national plan. So, and this is something that has been seen in other similar targets and policies as well. The NDCs, that are communicated to UNFCCC and corresponding national level targets, they're set at national level and then later apportioned to states. And this is not just an issue of participation, lack of participation and consultative decision making, but it is also an issue that hampers with prioritization of issues, because issues vary with different levels of government. And so, for instance, the focus on reducing GHG emissions via increased share of solar or wind in the energy mix is definitely a positive step. But overemphasis on that can lead to less attention on other measures as well. Thirdly, most of the action, it just stops at the level of states. And from the perspective of a multi-level federalism, the role of local, rural, and non-state institutions is still marginal in addressing climate change. And the fact that we do have rural village-level institutional framework in place, there is immense potential there. Coming to to the second part of your question, how governments address these challenges, I think it happens at different levels. There are, of course, multiple ways in which these are being addressed, but I would say that efforts are being made both at the level of federal government as well as state governments. So at a more central federal level, since funds and finance for climate action is an issue, intergovernmental transfers for environment and climate change has been used. And intergovernmental transfers in India is institutionalized in the form of a constitutional body, the Finance Commission, which for the past 2-3 terms has been considering environmental parameters as as one of the criteria for fiscal devolution. And these kind of fiscal transfers, both conditional and unconditional, when they take into account environment or climate factors, they send out important signals to states, in terms of being rewarded for maintaining forests as carbon sinks for rest of the country and the world, and also being compensated for the opportunity cost of keeping land and the forest cover. So it helps in kind of an agenda setting, as well as sending strong message and avoiding confusion, which otherwise happens quite a lot when we talk of these kinds of multi-level decision making. At the level of subnational governments, there have been several innovations, mostly sectoral. For instance, regulations or incentives for increasing renewable energy generation. Some states are innovating in terms of institutions for building knowledge networks and sharing of expertise amongst states, neighboring states, which have similar problems. In a few states, there has also been efforts to include cities and village level institutions. So for instance, in Kerala, there are these carbon neutral panchayats that are being tried, where the carbon neutrality is being addressed or is being tried at the lowest possible units of government. So those kinds of innovations are taking place. And finally, I'd say that the subnational action plans on climate change gave states some opportunity to prioritize their concerns. Unfortunately, since these action plans were largely top-down without commensurate support from the federal government, they could not really reach their potential, optimal level. But nevertheless, some states have been more proactive, and they've also come up with policies of their own, depending on their priorities. For instance, for electric vehicles, or for adaptation measures, in addition to what is happening at the national level, or what is mandated at the national level. So these are some of the measures that seem to be working.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. I'll now turn to Mulune.
Thank you, Professor, again. I think before answering your question with regards to challenges of federal and subnational intergovernmental relations encountered by policymakers while designing and implementing climate policies, I think it's good to just shed light on some of Ethiopia's policy framework as far as climate action is concerned. So we all know that Ethiopia is one of the most vulnerable country to the impacts of climate change, and this vulnerability has spurred much policy debate both in Ethiopia and beyond. The country has responded by taking very innovative steps where we formally merge our aim of developing a green economy while also building adaptive capacity and a greater resilience to climate change within a single policy framework, that is the 2011 Climate Resilient Green Economy Strategy, commonly known as CRG strategy. So CRG strategy was launched in 2011 and regarded as a blueprint for pursuing our ambitious aspiration of building a carbon neutral and resilient economy, society, and also environment by 2030. So the same strategy in 2015 was mainstreamed into our National Development Plan, which was called by then Growth and Transformation Plan, or GTP2. And then in the same year, in 2015, we have managed to communicate our intended national determined contribution, which was purely designed based on the CRG strategy targets. So this strategy, the CRG strategy, also informed the overall process of the new 10 years development plan, which runs basically from 2021 to 2030. So we have in place a new national development plan, which basically takes into account climate action at its heart, and basically it considers CRGE strategy as one of its major pillars. There are 10 pillars identified under this new 10-year development plan, and CRGE strategy, climate resilient green economy strategy, is one of the major pillars. So in a very general way, when we see the overall implementation of Ethiopia's climate policy, I think we need to interrogate how the CRG strategy has been implementing over the last 10 years. The CRG strategy basically follows a sectoral approach to address the impacts of climate change, and also has put in place various institutional architectures or governance structures. It also reflects basically cross-sectoral and multidisciplinary nature of the country. So at the national level, when you see the governance structure, climate change responses are coordinated by inter-ministerial steering committee. There is this committee called Inter-Ministerial Steering Committee, answerable to the Prime Minister office. And again, all ministers of sectoral institutions are members of the steering committee, including Minister of Agriculture, Minister of Transport, Minister of Energy, Water and Irrigation, and others key ministries in terms of climate action. So we have Inter-Ministerial Steering Committee at the apex, with the mandate of coordinating climate resilient green economy issues at the national level. And you have to bear in mind that this committee is answerable to the Prime Minister office. And in fact, now the Environment, Forest and Climate Change Commission is coordinating the committee on behalf of the Prime Minister office. And then under the Interministerial Steering Committee at the federal level, we have interministerial, not interministerial, CRG Management Committee that is called Climate Resilient Green Economy Management Committee, where sectoral ministers or land ministries and development partners, key development partners are represented by their state ministers or assigned representatives. And again, this management committee is very key in terms of making decisions, especially in the allocation of climate finance for various projects and programs. So we have this important structure at the federal level. And then we have another, for instance, sub-steering committee at the ministerial level. And also we have managed to set up a CRGE forum where different development partners, private sectors, important civil societies, and also influential individuals who have done very outstanding job also be represented. So the CRG forum is also another important platform exists at the federal level, basically to stock take where we are in terms of implementing the CRG implementation at the national level. And again, apart from setting up those institutions, the CRG strategy itself has established what we call the CRG facility, and this facility was operationalized in 2030, and it has two wings, what we call the financial wing and technical wing. The financial wing is under the Minister of Finance, and it has specifically the mandate of soil setting or mobilizing climate finance for various projects and program being implemented at the national level. Particularly the local context is very important in this regard, where regional states or regional bureaus heavily rely on this facility to get resource in order to implement climate action. So you see that there is a clear link between the federal and regional government. And there is also the technical wing, which is chaired by Minister of Environment, and the Minister of Environment is responsible for the technical elements, the nitty-gritties, and also day-to-day administration, as well as developing guidelines, rules for the CRGE implementation at the federal level. And then the local entities take those guidelines, rules, and mainstream into their local context. So we have this kind of arrangement on the federal level. So when we see
sorry to interrupt, Bolone, but could you conclude very briefly?
Okay. So we have this kind of the same arrangement at the regional level. Coming to main challenges related to federal governance and climate change context, I think we have to mention the following very important issues in our context. The first one has to do with the absence of effective national coordination across value chains, where, for instance, horizontally with the line ministries and vertically with the regional states, we don't have like a robust kind of coordination on various issues, which has been one of the most daunting challenges as far as implementing CRG implementation in CRG strategy in Ethiopia. And again, capacity issues has been major concerns. Capacity in terms of human, we don't have educated capacity both at the federal and the regional levels to implement the CRG implementations, the CRG strategy. Similarly, we have financial and institutional challenges related to implementing the CRG strategy. Again, there is also institutional structure challenges, like we don't have uniform kind of institutional arrangements both at the federal and regional level, which has been one of the main challenges in terms of spoiling the relationship between the federal government and the national government, and also lack of a robust kind of tracking system, what's happening at the local level, what is happening at the grassroots level has been very difficult to track due to absence of monitoring, reporting, and verification system or M&E system at both at the federal and global level. So this is all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mulune. So there are many challenges and some interesting practices on the ground in Ethiopia. Catherine, over to you.
Clearly not all federations are alike, and they face distinct challenges with respect to mitigation of climate change. I think Canada's federation probably faces particularly great challenges in reconciling its decentralized federal system with action on climate change. And I'll give you 3 reasons why I think that's the case. The first is the nature of that decentralization in the case of climate turns to a large degree on the fact that Canada's constitution assigned ownership of public lands, so-called crown lands, to provincial governments within their borders. And something like 95% of Canada's very large landmass is still publicly owned, although I would hasten to add that in many cases, the Aboriginal people who were colonized against their will have never ceded ownership of those territories. So I'm speaking to you from the unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. But in practice, provincial governments do exercise ownership authority over those crown lands, and that includes control of the natural resources on and beneath those lands, which includes fossil fuels. So provincial governments within Canada have closely guarded that jurisdiction, that authority that comes with ownership of natural resources, both as a source of provincial government revenues and also to pursue politically popular economic development. Second, and relatedly, those resources are not distributed equally among the provinces, and there are huge differences among Canada's provinces. Certain provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan are endowed with abundant fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, while others like Quebec have rushing rivers that can produce hydropower. And the result are huge differences in the carbon intensity of provincial economies, with a province like Quebec that was endowed with clean energy having emissions per person of under 10 tons per year of CO2, in contrast to Alberta and Saskatchewan that are more on the order of 60 to 65 tons per person per year. So those are huge differences in international terms. And that raises the specter of uneven costs of climate change mitigation among the provinces. And as a result of those uneven costs, very different levels of climate ambition among Canadian provinces, with fossil fuel dependent provinces much less ambitious than, as we've already heard, Quebec has been with its relatively low carbon economy. And third, with only 10 provincial governments and 3 territories, and combined with a Westminster-style parliamentary government, intergovernmental relations in the Canadian Federation often entails the first ministers, the prime minister and premiers, or the relevant ministers, in this case, often environment ministers, meeting and sitting around the same table to talk things out. And I guess in the pandemic, the equivalent would be that their faces all fit on one Zoom screen when they meet. And so there has been a norm of the ministers meeting regularly and as equals, with an expectation, though not constitutional requirement, for achieving consensus. So the combination of those things, provincial ownership of resources, uneven costs potentially of climate change mitigation, and a norm of federal provincial consensus has resulted for many years in the most fossil fuel dependent provinces, especially Alberta, vetoing agreement on a national action plan on climate change. And in the meantime, Canada's emissions grew since 1990 by about 20%. Now, since 2005, 2007, a subset of provinces have really led, and we've heard about the Quebec's leadership in emissions trading. British Columbia and Ontario have also undertaken notable climate policies, but we've had a situation of leaders without followers. The least carbon intensive provinces have been the ones that have been leading. The most carbon intensive provinces have not been following, and in fact have significantly increased their emissions and continued to do so. Now, a lot has changed with respect to those challenges in the last 5 years, and that's because the federal government became more assertive, rejecting that norm of federal provincial consensus, establishing a backstop national carbon price, and that federal action with respect to a backstop carbon price was recently upheld by Canada's Supreme Court. But that was 25 years in coming. And during that time, Canada's emissions increased, and we still ended up with a pretty ugly patchwork of provincial and federal carbon pricing policies with uneven prices, uneven coverage, and still lots of intergovernmental disagreement looming. So in terms of solutions, ways forward, I would say federalism has been more of an obstacle than an opportunity in Canada's ability to mitigate climate change, and that the solution has really been for Canada acting less like a federation, or at least like a less decentralized one, with the federal government assuming more authority to ensure that all subnational governments were moving forward with common purpose. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I also appreciate you, you were very succinct there in making those points, so grateful to you. And then finally, as we're finishing up our first, our round of discussion on the second point, I'll turn it over to Mr. Millbrandt and remind you to be somewhat brief, because we do have questions and answers to get to.
Thank you very much. Because of the leading role of the Federation in Germany concerning climate policy, we have no bigger coordination policy. Our system of federalism with sort of cooperation between states and federation has solved much of the internal problems up to now. However, we have many inconsistencies between the EU level and the member countries, despite the well-organized emission trading system I explained before. Important sectors are still outside the ETS: housing and heating, transportation sector based on combustion, except inter-European flights, and agriculture. In these sectors, the EU and national governments try to reduce carbon emission by regulation, especially by emission standards for vehicles, which strongly encourage electric traction and will phase out carbon traction for cars in the next 10 years or so. The EU has established reduction targets for the non-ETS sectors and for member states too. Deviations of these targets will be fined in the end. So the member states of the EU have interest to reach the targets, because otherwise they have to pay. In the meantime, the EU promised overall reduction of 55% in 2030 in relation to 1990 and climate neutrality in 2050. The Union must now considerably intensify its climate policy by reducing the annual ETS caps and expanding the ETS on transportation, heating, and if possible on agriculture. If the EU chooses regulatory alternatives, emission standards must be drastically tightened, which cost more than ETS caps. On top of this, all EU policies and actions are classified by a green taxonomy to reduce emission further. For the first time, reforestation as a carbon sink will be included in the policy mix. The role of nuclear power and carbon capture storage technology is disputed. Under discussion is avoiding carbon leakage and the loss of international competitiveness by border adjustment, vulgo custom duties. That is a real problem for Europe. the more they intensify their climate policy, the more costly carbon emissions are, the more in danger is competitiveness without a similar policy in other regions of the world. And therefore, in the end, if we want to achieve the climate targets I've discussed, we need some sort of custom duties based on carbon emission in the exporting countries. That is very difficult to achieve, I think. The other alternative is to enlarge our ETS system to other parts of the world. So far as I see it, your emissions system in Quebec and in some North American states are very similar to the ETS in Europe. So a link between this system would be advisable to avoid some sort of international trade war, which would be the result. So that is the European challenge. As a first step towards an enlarged ETS, Germany has introduced a special CO2 tax for heating and transportation, rising from 25 euros per ton to 55 euros. This tax shall be eventually integrated in the future ETS. However, the current ETS price is nearly 50 euros at the moment, or $60 per ton. And therefore, this special CTO tax is not enough for solving our problems. Then there's another problem in between Germany and the European Union with our Renewable Energy Act. We increase green energy by subsidizing it, but in the end, emissions are not reduced because power generation is within the ETS and the caps are the same. So if we reduce emissions of power generations of electricity by prioritizing green energy, our emissions are shifted to other European countries. So it's not intelligent to have two different policies for the same sector. If we have the ETS sector, then we have to concentrate on ETS caps and avoid other political issues. The real problem of all ETS systems is that, as you have mentioned for your countries, that the burden of CO2 emission reduction is very different between different countries, different regions, and different social layers of society. Therefore, in the end, you need a compensating system financed out of this CO2 emission rights, which redistribute income to those regions, to those countries, to those social sectors which are heavily burdened by climate policy, so that in the end you have a fairer distribution of burdens. I think that is necessary in the end to achieve the result reduction of CO2 emissions and to avoid global warming.
Okay.
But this problem, social and regional and national discrepancies on the one hand side, and the centralized ETS emission trading system is not yet solved politically. In theory, it's solved, but the implementation is not done so far. So in the end, you have a lot of problems in Europe for the next 5 to 10 years, especially if we really stick to this reduction targets as 55% in 2030 and net zero in 2050. Without these adjustments on the social and regional side, it will not happen.
Thank you so much. So I want to note now we're entering the final question and answer period. I'll just mention that we've been joined by Joanna Setzer, who, as I mentioned earlier, is co-editing the book that's being put together by the former federations on climate governance and federalism. So thank you for joining us, Joanna. We've received 2 questions through the chat. And so I'll ask you to maybe pick one as we go for one final round, if you want to answer. So one question is, has the COVID-19 accelerated or decelerated climate change or climate action in federal states? The second is, there of course are significant variations between federal and multi-level systems of governance, but what are good practices in intergovernmental collaboration on climate change that can be applicable across jurisdictions? And I will use my role as moderator at a third question, which builds on a point that's just been brought up by Mr. Millbrandt. So the question would be, how do we deal with the possible differences in burdens and costs that are imposed on different jurisdictions that are at different stages in transition to a low carbon economy? So I will go in the normal order, and then again, I'll ask you to be somewhat brief in your responses. So if you can, maybe 2 minutes maximum. So Needy, you go first.
Right, thank you. So for the first question with respect to COVID, it's an issue not just in India, but from what I've read, and especially UN Environment has done a very detailed analysis of recovery packages. And it estimates that 2.5% of all the spending is going towards GHG emissions reduction, and 18% of all the specific COVID recovery package is going to contribute to climate-related action. So, and in India, it's definitely lesser than that. And it, in my opinion, was a missed opportunity, because the COVID recovery package, it did make some recommendations and what should I say, sanctions for power sector in general, which would have contributed to renewable energy and other things. But a large portion of it went to coal mining. So which would eventually be actually counter to the whole climate change mitigation targets that we talk about. So would you want to go one question each, or would you want me to address all the questions, Sebastian?
Well, you've been quick enough. If you want to tackle the other one, maybe the compensation issue, is that one of interest to you?
Yeah, I would actually like to comment on the difference in burden, I mean, how to address difference in burdens and costs.
Yeah, perfect.
And this is something that, it of course is central to environmental federalism, resource federalism. And I mean, that there's, always going to be some kind of tension when we talk of benefits and burdens, because some states would be benefiting more, some states would be benefiting less, and would pay more for preserving the environment, or ensuring climate change mitigation, etc. And as Catherine was talking about, Canada also, that some states are generally rich in those kinds of resources, and that is the revenue source they have. So, and some in would be richer in renewable energy. So those will be very different. And in order to address this kind of disparity, intergovernmental transfers seem to be a good solution, especially for federal systems which have which are more centralized, I'd say, where we can have, which is, a body which can do this kind of equalization of transfers and give incentives, rewards, and also enable action at the level of states.
Great, thank you so much. Mulune, if you want to tackle one of these questions, or.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. As far as the first question is concerned, obviously the outbreak of the pandemic has affected our endeavor of addressing climate change in various forms. Like to just mention one simple example, we were supposed to communicate our updated NDC last year, like in a full-fledged manner, but we couldn't make it happen because of various reasons, including the fact that we cannot conduct consultation with all relevant stakeholders in due course of preparing the updated NDC. So obviously it has significant impact, but attempt has been made to make sure that our climate actions are being implemented in a very COVID response way. For instance, we have this Green Legal initiative, which was initiated by our Prime Minister 2 years ago, and it has very ambitious plan of planting 20 billion tree seedlings by 2022. So in the last two rainy summer seasons, we have managed to plant around like 9 billion tree seedlings, including in the COVID year, where we managed to plant around 6 billion tree seedlings. So we were even trying to operate in a COVID environment. So obviously it has a significant impact.
Great, thank you, Mulune. Do you want to weigh in on the question of distribution of burdens or good practices maybe that have emerged in Ethiopia that could apply elsewhere?
Yeah, it has been again one of the major concern as far as regional and federal interactions are concerned vis-a-vis climate action. And of course, we have this system put in place when we are allocating budgets for regional states. We have our own formula already designed by House of Federations. So budgets for climate actions are allocated based on that formula, which take into account first the vulnerability of regional states and also the natural endowment of the regional states themselves. For instance, some regions are very they have favorable condition to afforestation and reforestation endeavors, and so we basically take into account this kind of factors while doing the allocation of resources. I think it's also good to think of having a forum where we can facilitate learning among these federated entities in order to address this kind of tension or unnecessary draggings.
Great, thank you so much. Catherine?
I'm going to try really quickly tackle both of them, but I'm aware Sebastian might cut me off. On the fiscal capacity question, Canada has a long tradition, in fact, constitutional protection of a system of equalization where the federal government delivers a share of its tax revenues to the lowest income provinces to bring them up to an average of fiscal capacity. And that's also, I think, reinforced norms of sharing financial expenditures across the provinces. So it's made public spending one of the popular tools for climate policy, because that's a way for the federal government to sprinkle the money everywhere. In the federal backstop carbon pricing plan, if the federal government intervenes in a province, it sends any revenues back to that same province. last point I'll add on this one is that we tend to focus a lot on the uneven impacts of climate change mitigation across subnational governments, way more than we ever talk about the uneven benefits of natural resources, including fossil fuels, across those subnational governments. So in Canada, we tie ourselves in knots talking about how awful it would be if Alberta bears a greater share of the costs, when Alberta will still be wealthier per capita at the end of that than other provinces because of fossil fuels. The other question about COVID, COVID's interesting because it can go either way. On one hand, there's this opportunity to build back better and shift towards a green economy. On the other hand, the fossil fuel industry is also hurting, and it's a significant economic actor within Canada. I think what we've seen is a combination of COVID and persistently low global oil prices, on balance, reinforcing the Build Back Better narrative. The federal government has spent more money on green initiatives, although it has also given some money to the fossil fuel industry during the pandemic. But most importantly, it hasn't backed off on its regulatory initiatives. And in December announced an increase in the backstop carbon price from $50 per ton of CO2 in 2022 to $170 per ton in 2030, which has huge implications for the oil industry. So I think what it's done is undermine the narrative that existed 5 years ago that Canada needed healthy fossil fuel exports to afford the transition to clean energy. While with that industry struggling, it's not clear what economic benefits it's delivering to the country anymore, and that's facilitated to some degree transition towards cleaner energy.
Thank you. And maybe one practice in Canada that you think could travel to other jurisdictions in terms of federalism and climate governance?
Honestly, I think the most important one is the significance of the federal government role. In many ways, what happens within federations is a smaller version of what happens on the global stage in climate negotiations. And strangely, we never talk about how wonderful it is that all of those national governments are independent and get to do their own thing. We talk about how important it is to have concerted global action. Well, we have the benefit within federations of having constitutionally empowered central or federal governments that can do certain things that prevent that race to the bottom to ensure that there's minimum standards. And I think that's been the most important progress in Canada in 30 years.
Okay, thank you so much. Mr. Millbrandt.
Well, thank you for coming to the question of how COVID has influenced climate policies. First of all, because of the decrease of economic activity, CO2 emissions were reduced because of COVID, but that is a transitional effect. On the other side, the government has enacted a big recovery program for the economy, including investments for climate programs as well. And I think that is a good idea to use this money for fighting the economic consequences of COVID by addressing climate targets as well. Coming to the distributional problem of climate policy, it depends on the system you are in. I talked about emission trading system. In the emission trading system, you have income because normally the emission rights are sold by auction. So those who use the emissions rights, the polluter have to pay, and it goes to the center who is auctioning the emission rights and has a lot of money. And they can, this center, maybe the EU or some independent center, can redistribute money in two sorts. It can give money to poor people who are especially hit by high energy prices, which are the result of this emission trading system. So it's some sort of social policy, and you have money. On the other hand, special industries are hit, and it's possible to give some of the money you have raised as help for this industry, not for maintaining pollution, but for some sort of rebuilding, sectoral rebuilding this industry. For instance, if you have steel production, steel uses a lot of coal, and the only way to avoid CO2 emissions is to go to green hydrogen. That costs a lot of money. But if you have emissions right, you can give money for this sector so that he's able to transform the form of production from coal to hydrogen. A third example, in Germany, we are phasing out of coal. 3 of the 16 states in Germany have important coal industry, especially lignite industry, and they are not the states are compensated, but the people who are affected by it are compensated. There are the workers for retraining, the regions to find a new business model, a new economic model, and therefore the federation pays a lot of money to this to the people and the regions, not the states, the regions to reform and renew the industrial structure to the new challenges and possibilities. So I think this is necessary for all sorts of climate policy on the national basis, on the European basis, as well as on the international basis. Especially on the international basis, you have to give those who are hit by this transition some sort of some money. And the other element is you have to look at the carbon sinks as well. Look at the forest in jungle in Brasilia. In the end, the industrial countries have to pay for not cutting their trees in these areas. So this is sort of a global solution. You have to look at all aspects of compensation. But as I said, in the end, there is money enough in the system. And if you compare it with possible costs of not fighting climate change, it's the cheapest solution.
Mm-hmm.
But you need some international system, as we need a better European system as well. And you in those federations who have not this central responsibility of a federation for climate policy or for energy policy, you need some sort of reforming political and judicial system to solve the problems.
Thank you so much. And then finally, Joanna.
Hello, hi, Sebastian, and hi, hello, all the speakers. Apologies, I was teaching until now and was only able to join a bit later. But what I've already heard of the discussions, I can see you've been having really an interesting conversation here. And I would, in terms of the questions that have been asked, I was interested in the COVID-19 related questions and how this might be different in federalism. So I haven't seen actually research comparing policies in federalist countries and non-federalist countries, but what I would imagine is that, well, first of all, you have this both the opportunities to, through these new recovery packages, to have climate and environmental measures added to laws and policies that previously didn't cover so well these aspects. So the idea that this is an opportunity really for these climate objectives to be now included, and at the same time how in practice this is not happening always or to the level of ambition that we would ideally see. The issue of how federalism can help with that, I think the point that Catherine made was really very interesting, in that at least in the Canadian case, federalism has been more of an obstacle, and sometimes acting as what would be a not federalist system would help in this regard. But now bringing this to COVID, then I guess that might be perhaps an interesting area to explore, because many of these packages have been looking at the big policies, particularly in energy, that usually come from the federal level. So this would be a type of space where you really need the federalism to work, and especially the national governments to have to set the ambition right. That's the recovery packages for subnational governments are very limited in this post-COVID recovery and packages. So it's not an answer, but more a reflection about how this additional complication or opportunity brought by COVID could mean it's really important to understand federalism and the opportunities and the challenges in this current situation. And I think a second point that for me is very important relates to the fact that we have these coexisting policies that are either contradictory or unhelpful, or that clash with each other. And the subsidies are particularly important. For me, this is an area that we haven't been paying attention to so much, about how subsidizing renewables on one hand, but fossils on the other at the same time, what does this create, and how usually it's much, the subsidies for fossil fuels are much more significant than those for renewables. And this is an area that I think also has to be looked into very carefully, as in federal systems, there is even more chances for this to happen as more levels have competence to legislate. So you create even more opportunities for these fragmented or clashing types of policies. So for me, the thinking about the harmonization and identifying where clashes exist is something that should be a priority. And I would maybe send this question back to those of you who have experience in your own countries to ask, to what extent this is happening? To what extent do you already have within your countries an effort to harmonize or avoid this type of situation where you have policies that clash with each other? I would be curious if you have time to listen to experiences that you might have.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I think we can maybe hear from the group just one last go around, and then we'll conclude. So, Nidhi, any existing policies or practices that exist around dealing with conflicts between levels of government or policies?
But there does, exist this whole framework of a national action plan on climate change and state action plans flowing from there. So, it does give some kind of guidance and direction to what states must address. So, that ensures that there is some kind of harmony and, which areas to focus on. But it also has its limitations, because then it becomes, an issue of what the federal government has prioritized, so it's not really, but it does contribute to some kind of harmonization and ensuring that there's less conflict.
Okay, Bolune, do you want to weigh in on mechanisms to reconcile potential conflict?
I think it's almost similar to the case of India. As I was mentioning earlier, we have this interministerial steering committee with a mandate to overlook the overall implementation of climate-related issues in the country, which also include policy strategies and program issues. So it goes from the federal to the regional level. And it's the only way to ensure that policies are harmonized. And if there's in fact any interest from the regional states to draft a sort of new law or sort of proclamation that's focused on climate change and environment, they need to abide with what has been already promulgated or enacted by the federal government. So they have to make sure that it doesn't contradict the laws, the programs, policies already enacted by the federal government. So it's a sort of top-down approach, as it was already mentioned by Nidhi.
Catherine?
I think I'll just say briefly a bit more about how the federal carbon pricing backstop works in Canada. The federal government has set a backstop price and coverage and then says if a province meets that bar, they can do their own thing, whether it's through an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax. If they don't, the federal government weighs in and imposes a tax and dividend scheme where the money goes back to that province. And it did succeed in getting all provinces on board, although the federal government ended up having to intervene and impose a federal carbon tax in 5 provinces on households, and there's separate output-based pricing for industry. But at this point, it's challenging. It's challenging to reconcile a quantity-based emissions trading scheme in Quebec with a price-based carbon tax in other provinces. And I think that is going to become even more challenging. It's challenging because the provinces negotiate for slightly different coverage and loopholes. And I think the next year will be a critical one to determine whether that backstop unravels further and allows even more inconsistency, or whether some of those loopholes get closed.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Mr. Millbrandt, anything on conflict?
Well, the best way to solve the conflict is an allocation of competences which is consistent. Maybe in the end, constitutions have to be changed on a system being introduced. And coming to the CO2 emission problem, I think the best system is some sort of emission trading system, because you have an emission trading system all over the country, all over the continent, and within the system you can give autonomy to subnational governments without some inconsistencies. The worst system is to have a fragmented policy and a fragmentation of competences. Then you cannot avoid it because you need such a high degree of cooperation and harmonization that it's impossible to solve the problem. So you have to, I think, to concentrate on a few very simple but very powerful policies, and either in some sort of carbon taxes without any loopholes, or an emission trading system where the emission trading system has an advantage that you determine the emissions and not the costs. So you can steer, especially a reduction policy by an emission system better than by others, and you have the economic advantage that it is cost effective. Most are cost effective. So I think in the end, that are the two alternatives you have. Either you have some sort of very highly centralized system with a lot of coordination, harmonization, which in the end will give a wave to centralism, not to decentralism. The other is to protect decentralism by introducing a system for all, but which then works more or less automatically and allows the decentralized governments for some sort of autonomy. And I think looking at climate policy, I stress it, if it is a global problem, you need global solution and not fragmented decisions on local levels. That will not work in the end. It makes your conscience happy, but not the climate.
Thank you so much. So I think we've come to the end of our discussion today. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank people who were able to send in their questions. As we've mentioned earlier, there is a book being developed on this topic. It will look at a range of issues and deal, I think, with the fact that the context in which this relationship between climate governance and federalism unfolds is really key. I think also just one point I want to add is in terms of the time. So there may be a period in your transition to a decarbonized society where there's room for experimentation, where fragmentation might be a good thing in the sense of experimenting, innovating, and learning, and then you might reach a certain period where more coordination is needed. So I think thinking about this in terms of a transition is really, really important. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rupak for final remarks, and thank everybody again.
Thank you, Sebastian. I just wanted to add my thanks to that of Sebastian. Let me actually first start by thanking Sebastian for ably managing the discussion and the time and making sure that everyone was involved, and even having the opportunity to address questions that came from the audience. I'm informed that we had almost 150 people who watched this event, many of whom sent in questions. So this is a wonderful thing that we've been able to connect with so many people. Let me thank the panelists for taking the time to join us. I know everybody is in a different time zone. So Professor Harrison, Professor Millbrandt, Atto Mulune, Nidhi, Joanna, thank you for joining us after your starting your teaching responsibilities. I'm glad we could put this panel together, and we had some very good discussions. Last but not the least, I also want to recognize people who behind the scenes who went into putting this event together. Let me start by thanking our two translators, Beatrice Beer and Zachary, for their support to the sessions in ensuring that we had seamless interpretation. And of course, my colleagues who've spent months and weeks putting this all together, Diana Chebanova, John Light, Liam Whittington, and Asma Zrivi. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I think this has been a great success. Oh, Nidhi, I'm sorry I didn't mention you, but thanks very much for your participation. I can, given everything else that's going on in Delhi at this time, thank you very much for taking the time to join in. Well, I wish everyone a good week, and please, if time allows, join us for our other sessions every Tuesday morning at the same time until June the 1st. All the best.